In August 2023, when Flight 433 prepared for takeoff from Dubai International Airport. No one had any idea that by the end of this flight, their perceptions would be challenged and their hearts would be tested. At the front of the airplane's first-class cabin sat Andrea, a black woman who carried herself with a poised elegance. She wore simple, understated clothing that revealed nothing of the wealth or status she secretly possessed. For now, she was just another passenger, a quiet presence who observed more than she spoke. Further down the aisle, a flight attendant named Helen moved briskly, greeting passengers with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Helen was known among her colleagues for her efficiency, but also for her barely veiled contempt toward anyone who didn't fit her narrow idea of who deserved first-class luxury. As she passed rows of travelers, her gaze occasionally flicked toward Andrea, the only black woman in that exclusive section, her expression tightening each time. The plane's interior felt calm but tense, as if everyone was subconsciously bracing for something unexpected. The passengers sipped champagne, tapped on laptops, and adjusted their sleeping masks. Outside, the runway lights stretched toward the horizon like tiny beacons guiding their flight into the night sky. No one knew what would unfold in a few hours, least of all Helen and Andrea, whose fates were about to collide. Before the final boarding announcement, Helen crossed paths with a fellow flight attendant who tried to share a kind word. Helen brushed her off, her mind already fixed on what she perceived as a mistake in the seat assignments. She couldn't understand why someone like Andrea was placed in first class. With a forced smile and clenched jaw, Helen prepared to deliver service with subtle hostility, unaware that every move she made would soon come under scrutiny. This flight had only just begun. With the seatbelt signs illuminated, Flight 433 accelerated down the runway. The roar of engines filled the cabin as passengers closed their eyes, held their breaths, or whispered silent prayers. Soon, the aircraft soared into the dark sky, leaving Dubai's glittering skyline behind. Andrea gazed out of her window at the distant lights shrinking below, her expression calm but thoughtful. She was here for a reason, though no one could guess what that reason might be. Helen began her service, pushing a polished trolley down the aisle. Her posture was immaculate, her uniform crisp. On the surface, Helen looked like the perfect flight attendant, efficient, professional. But underneath that veneer was a simmering resentment. She was on the lookout for passengers who didn't fit her personal criteria for belonging in first class. Andrea, unfortunately, stood out like a target. Half an hour later, the cabin lights dimmed slightly for dinner service. Passengers lowered their tray tables, curiosity piqued by the gourmet menus. As Helen approached Andrea, the tension grew almost palpable. The flight attendant forced a thin-lipped smile, not out of kindness, but out of duty. Andrea met her gaze, silently noting every detail: the tightened jaw, the narrowed eyes, the subtle sneer. "May I see your ticket again, ma'am?" Helen asked, her tone just a touch too sharp. Andrea produced it without a word. Some nearby passengers glanced over, sensing something off. Helen's polite facade cracked as she leaned forward and whispered something cruel, something laced with a derogatory tone about Andrea's race and her supposed lack of etiquette. Andrea stiffened. She said nothing at first, letting Helen's words hang in the air. As the trolley rolled on, Helen mumbled complaints under her breath, making it clear that she thought Andrea didn't belong. Andrea didn't confront Helen immediately. Instead, she stored that moment away, determined to remember it for what it was: a test of character. In the background, the engines hummed steadily. No one knew that this small interaction was the first domino to fall, setting in motion a chain of events that would change lives before the plane touched American soil. The dinner service progressed with quiet efficiency, but a strange undercurrent of tension flowed through the cabin. Passengers who had overheard Helen's sharp words exchanged worried glances. Was this just a misunderstanding, or something more sinister? Andrea sat calmly, her demeanor serene, as if weighing her options. A few rows behind, a middle-aged couple whispered about the flight attendant's behavior. They had traveled widely and never seen something quite like this before. In first class, service was supposed to be impeccable, respectful. The idea that someone could be targeted simply because of their race made them uneasy. They debated whether they should say something, but for now, fear of causing a scene held them back. As Helen continued her rounds, her confrontational energy only grew bolder. She seemed to relish the idea of putting Andrea in her place. When Andrea requested a glass of water, Helen took her time, rolled her eyes, and responded in an icy tone, "Are you sure you're comfortable here? Perhaps you'd be happier in the back." The words dripped with condescension. Andrea chose that moment to speak softly, but clearly, "Is there a problem?" The tension magnified, and even Helen's fellow flight attendants paused. Helen scoffed, leaning in, making a remark about how certain people didn't understand first-class decorum. It was a blatantly racist insinuation, and everyone in earshot recognized it. Andrea, maintaining her composure, responded not with anger but with a simple, "You are mistaken." But Helen pushed further, going so far as to insult Andrea's appearance and even tug at her dress sleeve, causing a noticeable tear. That's when Andrea's patience snapped. The resounding slap Andrea delivered echoed through the stunned cabin. Passengers gasped, some half standing out of their seats, unsure if they should intervene. In that moment, all eyes turned to the scene unfolding at the front. Helen's face flushed with shock and rage. Andrea's expression was calm, yet firm. This was no ordinary passenger, that much was clear. As the tension mounted, a new presence stepped into the scene, a uniformed officer, David, and 2 guards, determined to restore order. David, the officer on board, approached with purposeful strides. His uniform bore the airline's insignia, indicating an authoritative role. 2 security guards followed closely behind him, scanning the scene with professional alertness. The cabin fell into a hush as he confronted Andrea and Helen. Every passenger leaned forward, straining to catch every word. Helen took the first opportunity to speak, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. She pointed an accusing finger at Andrea, trying to paint her as a disruptive passenger who struck a crew member. The passengers, however, weren't easily fooled. They had witnessed Helen's harassment and knew that Andrea's action, while dramatic, was provoked by brazen disrespect. David listened, his eyes shifting between Helen's defensive posture and Andrea's calm stillness. Something about Andrea intrigued him. He had been informed before the flight that someone very special was traveling incognito. His superiors had mentioned it in hushed tones. He hadn't known who it was, until now. When David asked Andrea for her identification, a ripple of curiosity passed through the cabin. Andrea produced it quietly, her hands steady. As David read the ID, his stern expression softened. Surprise, even a hint of reverence, danced across his features. He immediately instructed the guards to stand down, then turned to Andrea with a tone that was suddenly respectful, almost deferential. Passengers traded puzzled looks. Why was the officer changing his demeanor so drastically? Helen's defiance faltered. She watched as David bowed his head slightly and said, "My apologies, ma'am. Please take your seat. We will handle this matter." Helen's face went pale. This was not the response she expected. Over the following minutes, David conferred discreetly with the pilot and a few other crew members. The tension in the air grew thicker. Rumors spread in hushed voices. Was Andrea a government official? A celebrity? A diplomat? As the plane continued its journey through the night sky, a quiet sense of foreboding settled over everyone. Something monumental was unfolding, and no one could escape the gravitational pull of the mystery that now engulfed Flight 433. As the hours passed, the cabin fell into an uneasy silence. Outside, the sky remained a featureless canvas of deep, endless darkness. Inside, the mood was anything but calm. Passengers exchanged whispers, each theory more elaborate than the last. Some thought Andrea was a high-ranking executive. Others believed she might be related to royalty. A few speculated she was an undercover inspector sent to evaluate the crew. Helen remained rooted near the galley, nervously tapping her foot. She tried to catch David's eye, but he seemed deliberately distant. She knew her career hinged on the next few minutes, perhaps even seconds. Should she apologize to Andrea? Beg for forgiveness? Her pride battled with fear, and neither was winning. Meanwhile, Andrea sat quietly, reflecting on the events. She had come on this journey with a purpose, to see firsthand how her airline's staff treated passengers, especially those they deemed less deserving. She needed to confront this bigotry, to draw it out into the open, and make an example that would resound through the entire organization. Helen's behavior presented a painful but perfect opportunity. The plane, scheduled to land in a matter of hours, seemed to shrink in size as tensions rose. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that they were making good time. Beneath his professional tone, listeners might detect a hint of anxiety. Word had spread to the cockpit about Andrea's true identity, and everyone on board understood this flight would be remembered. In the far corner of the cabin, a group of passengers discussed whether they should say something on Andrea's behalf. One woman insisted they offer support, while her companion hesitated, not wanting to interfere. Another gentleman, a seasoned traveler, mentioned that he'd never seen a senior airline official behave so calmly under such hostility. "Mark my words," he said. "There's more to this story." Andrea waited, her eyes drifting from one anxious face to another. The power dynamics in the cabin had shifted drastically. Soon, a revelation would come that would make everyone rethink their initial assumptions. The suspense was thick, and the truth waited just beyond the horizon. In the dimly lit cabin, David approached Andrea again, this time accompanied by a handful of senior crew members summoned from other parts of the plane. They bowed their heads slightly, addressing Andrea with a respect that bordered on reverence. Passengers watched, stunned. Who was this black woman, dressed so simply, who could command such deference from the airline's own hierarchy? Helen hovered nearby, her heart pounding. She tried to catch snippets of conversation. Words like owner, inspection, and undercover drifted faintly through the hush. She felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of her neck. Had she truly insulted someone who could ruin her career in an instant? Her throat tightened. Andrea looked at the assembled crew members, her voice calm and measured. "I am traveling today because I needed to see for myself how our customers are treated," she began. The mention of our customers confirmed what many had suspected. She was no ordinary passenger. She was someone who had a stake, perhaps a controlling stake, in this very airline. At these words, a murmur spread through the cabin like a wave. Passengers leaned into the aisle, their faces reflecting shock and fascination. The truth was out in the open now, and there was no turning back. Andrea explained that she had intentionally kept her identity hidden, dressing modestly and traveling alone to observe the genuine nature of her staff's behavior. She wanted to find and address any prejudice that could tarnish the airline's reputation. Helen's face turned ashen as Andrea's words confirmed the worst of her fears. She stood, trembling slightly, as Andrea turned her gaze toward her. Andrea spoke softly, her tone neither vengeful nor kind, but resolute. "You have misused your position to demean others. You have acted against the very values we strive to uphold." David stepped forward, announcing that Helen's employment was terminated effective immediately. The passengers gasped. Helen pleaded tearfully, begging for another chance. Andrea remained silent for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle. Soon the plane would begin its descent, and by the time they landed, nothing would remain the same. The seatbelt sign blinked back to life, and a gentle chime sounded through the cabin. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing that the plane would begin its descent into New York's JFK Airport in approximately 15 minutes. Outside, the horizon glowed faintly with the approach of sunrise, Inside, emotions ran high. Curiosity, shame, relief, and anticipation all swirled together in the confined space. Helen stood there, tears welling in her eyes. She knew she had no defense. Her actions spoke for themselves. She had humiliated a passenger, torn her clothing, and spewed hateful words. Now, stripped of her authority and her career prospects, she faced a sudden and painful reckoning. Andrea watched her with a steady gaze, letting the silence speak volumes. Passengers began to whisper among themselves. Some applauded quietly, acknowledging Andrea's stand against injustice. Others wiped away tears, moved by the unexpected turn of events. The airline's owner, a mysterious and dignified figure they had never expected to meet, had traveled incognito among them and had chosen this moment to reveal her true identity. It was a story that would be told and retold, each time with a sense of disbelief and awe. David and the other crew members hovered, unsure of their next steps. They had witnessed a transformation of power dynamics in mid-flight. Where once Helen had lorded her status over Andrea, now Andrea held the future of their entire professional lives in her hands. Yet Andrea's posture remained gracious. She looked at Helen for a moment longer, and then did something surprising. She forgave her. The sudden act of mercy shocked everyone. Andrea's voice remained even as she explained, "I came here to teach a lesson, not to destroy a life. I want this airline to embody fairness, respect, and dignity for all." Helen, sobbing softly now, thanked her repeatedly, promising to change, to learn, to never again judge someone by their appearance or background. As the landing gear deployed, the cabin fell into a contemplative hush. They were minutes away from touching down, and no one doubted that they were about to leave Flight 433 with changed hearts and minds. The cabin windows revealed the twinkling lights of New York City as the plane made its final approach. Andrea leaned back in her seat, her mind filled with thoughts of what had transpired. She had come on this journey, expecting to confront ugly biases lurking within her own company. She had seen it firsthand in Helen's behavior. Yet, the resolution that followed, her firm stand against discrimination, and then her unexpected forgiveness, felt both powerful and poignant. Across the aisle, passengers stared openly at Andrea now. Some offered nods of respect, others mustered brave smiles. A few raised their hands in gentle applause, a quiet tribute to the courage they had just witnessed. The mood was one of a strange camaraderie that can form when people witness a life-altering event together. In just a few hours, these strangers had shared an unforgettable experience. Helen, still trembling from the emotional confrontation, took a seat in a vacant row, face buried in her hands. She felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. The lesson Andrea taught her would not be forgotten easily. She had been given a second chance, and now it was up to her to become a better person, whether she ever wore a flight attendant's uniform again or not. David, the officer, quietly approached Andrea. He spoke softly, ensuring no passenger missed his words. "Ma'am, I will personally report everything that happened today. Your message will be carried forward, and all staff will understand the gravity of what occurred here." Andrea nodded, acknowledging his pledge. The pilot's steady voice instructed everyone to prepare for landing. Seatbacks were raised, tray tables locked, and seatbelts fastened. The cabin crew, chastened and introspective, moved methodically through the final checks. Each step they took now carried new meaning. They understood that this was more than a routine flight. It was a moment of reckoning that would shape the airline's future policies and values. As the airplane descended, Andrea looked around. She saw passengers who had found their voices, standing up for what was right, and crew members who had learned the importance of kindness. Soon the wheels would touch the tarmac, and the lessons of Flight 433 would echo far beyond this journey. The wheels touched down with a gentle bump, and the engines roared softly as the plane taxied toward its designated gate. Slowly, the cabin lights brightened, revealing tired but thoughtful faces. Passengers gathered their belongings, still whispering about the extraordinary night they had just experienced. They would never look at air travel, or each other, the same way again. Andrea stood, smoothing her rumpled dress. The tear Helen had made remained as evidence of what had transpired. Yet Andrea bore it with quiet dignity, a reminder that appearances and assumptions do not define a person's worth. She prepared to disembark, her heart lighter knowing the message she wanted to convey had been delivered powerfully. Helen remained seated, still grappling with her emotions. She wanted to approach Andrea, to apologize once more, to beg for understanding. But something about Andrea's calm presence told her the point had already been made. Andrea's forgiveness had been genuine, and now it was Helen's responsibility to live up to it. One by one, passengers stepped into the aisle. Some paused to nod at Andrea, offering silent thanks for what she had done. Others whispered words of admiration. A few, who had been content to remain silent bystanders, now regretted not speaking up sooner. Even so, they understood that Andrea's lesson was for everyone. Stand against prejudice, treat others with respect, and never judge by mere appearances. David stood near the exit, ensuring a smooth departure. He gave Andrea a knowing look and murmured, "We will do better." Andrea acknowledged him with a slight smile. As the aircraft door opened to the morning air, the mood shifted from introspective to hopeful. This was a new day, and they were stepping into it with fresh perspective. Outside, the airport's neon signs flickered, and ground crews went about their routines, unaware of the transformative drama that had just unfolded inside the cabin. As Andrea stepped onto the jet bridge, she knew her work was not done. There would be reports, policy reviews, and extensive training sessions. But this flight, with its drama and its revelations, was the catalyst that would make meaningful change possible. In the terminal, passengers dispersed into the bustling flow of travelers, each carrying the memory of Flight 433 with them. Some looked back at the aircraft, still parked at the gate, as if expecting something more to happen. Others pulled out their phones, eager to recount the night's incredible story to friends and family waiting beyond the security lines. Andrea moved quietly through the crowd, unrecognized now that she had stepped away from the plane. She had always been somewhat of a private figure, preferring to let the airline's brand speak for itself rather than courting the spotlight. But after tonight, she understood that leadership sometimes demanded personal involvement and direct action. Before leaving the terminal, Andrea paused by a large window overlooking the runway. The sunrise painted the sky with pinks and oranges, a symbol of renewal. She reflected on the lessons learned, that no one is immune to prejudice, and that vigilance is needed to root it out. She understood the importance of making each employee feel responsible for the company's values. She resolved to implement new training programs, stricter oversight, and perhaps opportunities for employees like Helen to learn and grow. Across the hall, a few passengers who had recognized her from the flight's dramatic moments watched curiously, uncertain whether they should approach. Sensing their hesitation, Andrea offered a gentle nod and a warm, reassuring smile. In that small gesture, she acknowledged their presence and their role as witnesses. They had seen injustice confronted head-on, and they had seen how understanding and forgiveness could follow. After a moment, Andrea turned and made her way toward the exit. Outside, the city awaited, teeming with countless stories of hope, struggle, and redemption. The events aboard Flight 433 would linger in her mind. They would inspire changes not only in her airline's practices, but also in her personal approach to leadership. As Andrea stepped into a waiting car, she carried with her the memory of that tense cabin, the shocked faces, and the heartfelt applause. It would live on as a story told in lounges and dinner tables worldwide, a reminder that sometimes the quiet observer can become the catalyst for profound change.